In this video, we will be talking about the second step of our validation process, which is interviews. But before we go into that, I wanted to make a quick note on tests and methods in general. So by now you have the list of all the assumptions that you want to test, you put them together in a tracker, and you want to figure out what the quickest and cheapest way to test them is. There are many different ways to do that. In this video series, I will be talking about interviews as well as landing pages, because I believe that those are two things that everybody has to do. Those are also two of the best and kind of most proven, most reliable and most insightful ways to do startup or business idea validation, but there are many other methods, and I encourage you to be creative. If you're looking for an overview of all the different methods out there, one of the best ones I found is by Giv Constable, who's an author of Talking to Humans, which is a great book. It's available digitally. I encourage you guys to read it. If you haven't, it's a very good book on how to talk to a customer, and it goes in more detail about interviews as well. As you can see here, interviews are low on believability of information score, but at the same time, they are something that we cannot skip, because they give you the kind of level of insights that really helps you to build a business going down the road. And you will see later in this video what I mean by that. One other thing that I wanted you to notice in this graph is that surveys are not in there. It's one of the most common things that people ask me, whether survey is a good way to validate. And my answer is a strict no. I don't think personally that surveys help you understand the people and their motivations and their pains and the problems, and that they are a good way. And I use the previous graph as sort of a confirmation of that. And I get it a lot that people ask why, and I've listed a couple of reasons. There are many more. Number one reason is that in a survey there is no room for asking unplanned questions, which is very important at this stage, because, for example, you ask them, how often do you use this or that, and you expect it to be like once a week, but they tell you they use it once a year, and you kind of really know when to understand why. Or you find something very interesting and unexpected, and something you wouldn't have thought before, and you want to go really deeper and investigate this question. This is something a semi-structured or an open-ended interview really allows you to do well. Number two reason is that in a survey there is no way to see a person's reaction. One of the main things about interviews is that there is the observational component of that. You are seeing a person, you are with them. I know right now it's difficult to do in-person interviews, but you can do them on Zoom or any other video calling where you can actually see the person's reaction. You can see if you make them feel uncomfortable, you can ask them why. That just allows for a different level of interaction. And the third reason is actually quite interesting, because most people think it's the other way around. In an interview, you might actually find out more and people would be more open, which is quite counterintuitive, because usually we think that surveys are anonymous, and that would mean that people would be encouraged to share more because you wouldn't necessarily know who they are. But I think it's quite the opposite, because in an interview, you sit down with a real person for a conversation. You talk to them, you might be drinking coffee with them. Your job as an interviewer is to make them feel comfortable so that they would open up to you. And that usually allows you to learn much more than a survey where a person sits in front of a computer and just types things up, and where they don't really have an actual human touch and interaction. Here, if I hopefully by now convince the survey people that the interviews are good, the question that I'd probably get next is, how about statistical significance and all sort of like representativeness and things like that? And the answer honestly is we don't care. We are doing qualitative research. It's called qualitative for a reason. We are not after numbers. We are after quality. We need deep insights. And what you might find interesting if you're thinking down the statistical significance kind of route is that in such schools of thinking as design thinking, for example, people encourage you to do extreme user interviews because they provide you with deeper insights. So how representative of a sample it is not our concern here at all. We are really after deep insight. The next thing you might want to think about when you're setting up your interview is that there are In this startup validation world, there are two types of interviews. There's a problem interview and a solution interview, and ideally you would want to keep them separate. The problem interview is an initial one when you talk to the customer about them. We don't care about the product. We forget about it entirely. We don't talk about it at all. We start the conversation by asking the person to tell us a bit about their background. Then we go into really understanding a particular aspect of their life where you and your product are trying to fit in. Really trying to understand their problems, their jobs to be done, their motivations, and their journey. In a solution interview later down the line, we would talk to them about the product and the idea. But this is something ideally you'd like to do separately. In a perfect world, you schedule the problem interview first, and then down the line, when you're later in your validation, you talk to them about the solution. But the reality is usually quite different, and it's very difficult to keep two separate. Sometimes you are struggling to get enough time in a person's calendar, or you just feel like it's a bit of a waste. So what I found myself doing at the end is doing kind of 80-20. What it means is that for the first, let's say if you do an hour interview, for maybe around 40 minutes, you're only talking about the problem. You don't introduce your solution, you don't mention it to them, you just ask them questions about their experience in their life and their motivations. And then at the end of that, you say, thank you very much, it was very insightful. I wanted to briefly introduce you to Zebra Farm, which is a startup skills platform. You see where I'm going with that, right? And then you gather some initial feedback, but also you get a person interested in what you are doing so that you can build a relationship going forward and maybe sign them up for a wait list if they are interested or something like that. So combining the two is fine as long as you keep the first big chunk of the interview completely separately from your product idea and a business. I've been interviewing for a couple of years professionally now, and I wanted to give you a couple of quick tips. Obviously, you can write a whole book on that. And actually there is one, it's called the Mom Test. If you're really struggling with the interviews, you might want to read this, but some quick tips from my side. So there are a couple of don'ts, and there's a very common mistakes I see founders, especially first timers, make. One is don't make it too formal. Think of it as a coffee with a friend or an acquaintance as opposed to a formal kind of interview. You are asking them to record if you can, if you feel like that, if they allow you to, but don't make it very formal. Don't send them invites that say, startup interview something, thank you very much for agreeing for me to interview you, here's the list of questions. Unless they explicitly ask you for something like that. Don't send them anything very formal, just keep it casual. I mean, think of it as an ideal situation for this is just to bump into somebody in a coffee shop, find out that they're within the target group that you're trying to understand better, and just chat to them. This is what it should feel like. Don't make it too formal. Their second point that kind of builds up on what I've just said is sticking to the guide. So you put together an interview guide, a list of questions, but the idea there is not to say, my first question is this, oh, thank you. So my next question is that, and then go one by one, following the list. This is very bad. You're making the person feel quite uncomfortable. I've been on their interviewee side where it happened to me, and I realized it's actually quite bad. What you're trying to do is just to ask them questions. And if they talk about something in the beginning that you expected to talk about in the end, just ask them things that are relevant. Make it a conversation. Don't stick to the guide like it's their specific order that you had to do. Then you could just send out a survey, so that's not the point. And the third most important don't is don't ask leading questions. Very often we ask people the questions the way they tell us what we want to hear, which is a very safe bet for us, and that's what people default to because you're trying to confirm your assumptions, so you're asking the questions the way they would tell you what you want to hear. But it's the worst thing you can do. And other than asking leading questions where you kind of tell them what you want to hear, it could also be that you are almost like priming them to tell you what you want. Very often it happens with sustainability related projects where in the beginning people introduce the problem and they make it sound very big and bad. We are developing the solution to tackle their plastic waste in the ocean and this and that and that. And then 2-3 minutes later, they ask a person, so how do you feel about plastic in the ocean? And obviously they are not going to tell you, we don't care or anything like that because you've already told them how big of a problem that is. So you prime them to think this way. So that is something you're really trying to avoid. And this is also one of the reasons you're not talking about the solution in the first part. You're really talking only about the customer and the problem. And the last don't, which I had to learn myself the hard way, is not to talk. You're trying to make sure that all the time, like most of the time, they speak and you listen, and you just express agreement, you ask them clarifying questions, but your job is not to talk. Your job here is to listen. And a couple of do's. One is, in every interview, you have to ask at least one question that can destroy your business. It's very important. You have to keep it in mind, because otherwise it's almost kind of a waste. And it's very, very good, because everybody is a bit afraid of finding out that their assumptions don't hold. This is actually a good thing. It usually means that you've done a good job at validating, and you've done it quickly enough so that you can still iterate, change slightly, adjust, and build a successful business. And the other thing is, and that I think might be quite a good recommendation, is to have 3 things in mind that you want to learn. Because I know we have a guide and we kind of want to stick to that, but you want to have at least 3 takeaways or 3 kind of areas. So try to keep it down to 3 if you find it difficult to just follow the whole guide. This way you'd make sure that you have some findings that are relevant to your validation research that you are doing. Their important thing doing interviews is to make sure that you keep it in mind what you're actually trying to find out. And those are 2 things. Number 1 is quite clear. What you're trying to understand is your customer needs and motivations and whys. And that should be obviously connected to their assumptions that you're making and trying to test. But that's just in general, that's the core of the interview. But there is another thing that people forget very often, is that you can also use the interview as an opportunity to understand where you can find the users, the customers, where they are, where can you target them, what do they use, what channels do they usually find out about similar things from, and things like that. This is something that has to be incorporated in an interview, and you will see in their traction test and video why this is so important for us at this stage. A question I get very often is how to find people to talk to. And many founders come back and say, we're struggling to find people, it's so difficult. And the honest answer to the question is, if you cannot find the people to talk to about your product, how will you ever build a business around it? If you can't even get somebody to talk to, how are you going to find somebody to sell to? Right? It's kind of an underlying idea. And what it brings us to is that it's not that finding interview subjects is very different from finding your customers. Think about it the way, you put your canvas together, you had some channels. That's your time and chance to test whether these channels are actually good to acquire the customers or interview subjects, for that matter. And don't be afraid to ask people for an interview, because ultimately what you're doing, you're trying to solve the problem that's supposed to be so important to them. So if they really care and they want a solution, they would be quite happy to talk to you. So that brings us back to the interview toolkit I put together for you, like more practical advice. So how do we actually do that? The first one is, ideally, you should be able to record that. Obviously, you have to ask for consent. I suggest you use Otter.ai or any other transcription tool for that, but I find Otter quite brilliant, been using it for a couple of years. So that will help you. It will take the audio and make a transcript of that for you. Then I suggest you take some quick notes by hand. That just helps you because you think about things quite differently when you're writing things down. You should still be in the interview. So if you're recording, the main reason for that is that the transcript is running there by itself, but you are talking to the person. So don't get distracted by note taking. But sometimes if something very kind of important occurs to you, just write it down. Right after the interview, I suggest you schedule 10 to 15 minutes to capture insights. I do that on Miraboard, and as I mentioned before, in the last video in the series, we will go through the Miraboard template I've prepared, where there is an interview capture sheet that should help you take out the main takeaways from that. And brief your team. Don't do that necessarily after every single interview. You can if you have an opportunity to, but make sure that you have regular slots in your calendars to sit down and talk about what you found out. Because them reading through your notes probably is not going to be as good as you telling them. Important here is that you're not telling them what you found out. You are telling them what the user or the customer told you. That is a very important distinction right here. And the last practical tip is that I suggest don't schedule more than 2 interviews a day. I'm sure somebody can do that, but I think one is, I guess, kind of a best practice. If you want to really do things quickly, you may do more, but doing more than 2 interviews a day, you'll probably find out that it's quite challenging and difficult. It just really wears you off because you are there, you're paying attention to the person, you're making them feel comfortable, you're potentially taking notes, you're really trying to make sure you digest everything they say, and it takes quite a bit of energy. So in my experience, doing more than 2 a day is very, very difficult. So this is it for their interview video. In the next part, we'll talk about putting together value proposition and a little bit about the customer. So I'll see you there.